Good morning, everybody. How are you? Thank you all for joining me this morning, and thank you to DLD for inviting me. And I have slides, so I guess I'll just say next slide, or do I have a clicker? May I? Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So what I'm going to do this morning is give you just a very short, tantalizing set of teasers from my latest book, which is here in the bookshop. And the book is called Beyond the Valley. And I am an academic, but I wrote this book like a journalist. And I wrote this book in a human-centered way, in a storytelling-oriented way, telling stories from people across the world who are experiencing digital transformations in ways that are both promising and problematic at the same time. And really what this book centers around is a moment that we currently inhabit right now, where there's an asymmetric set of systems of power in charge of technologizing our world, right? So very few companies in very small regions of the world are responsible, and it's not just about Facebook, it's not just about Amazon, for technologizing our world, meaning every one of our experiences, both at present, to some extent, and moving forward more and more, from how we receive life insurance, to how we receive medical insurance, to even our notions of risk and lending and access to housing. All of these are computed and expressed upon by digital technologies. But the problem is a few companies that are geographically asymmetrically located, that are racially and gender-wise even more asymmetric in their composition, are making hidden, opaque, and unaccountable and untransparent decisions about how these technologies function and the values for which they are optimized. You know, just as a simple example, you can see how the largest companies in each of these verticals in the world, from taxis to accommodation to so on, they call themselves technology companies, but their business model is based upon cutting labor out at all costs, trying to own almost nothing, and basically taking a cut of every so-called peer-to-peer exchange. And that is a brilliant model for capital accumulation and speculated valuation. It's not a good model necessarily for the economic, political, and global health of our world, especially in an era of climate crisis. And I think that's extremely important because when we have just a few companies in a few parts of the world impacting the lives of billions of people in the world, we have an opportunity to humanize technology, to really engage in and arrive at an internet that lifts all boats, that is not zero-sum, but that is built upon the image of our collectivity as human beings. And so what I'm going to do today is just speak with a few teasers of examples of this book, which explores political, economic, and global and cultural life across the world in relation to digital technologies. But I'm going to primarily focus on the global issues at play, and the goal is to get you seduced so you can actually come for more, read the book, check it out, and we can talk about this further. And this is just a short presentation this morning on these issues. So we often ascribe metaphors and myths to describe technology, especially ones that we barely understand, like the internet, right? But in reality, the internet is a set of material infrastructures. You know, we use terms like the cloud to describe the internet, but in reality, also, the internet is accessible through two major modalities: fiber optic cables underneath the ocean's surface, and a set of satellite televisual infrastructures, right? Telecommunications infrastructures. But if you look at the actual constitution of the material internet as it stands, it reflects these asymmetries across the world. It reflects geopolitical and political and economic relationships of power and privilege. Look at this map right here, and I can talk to you about this more later. Two major fiber optic cables connecting the two major continents of the global south. Right? South America and Africa. Two major cables connecting them. So you can actually realize that on an infrastructural access-based level, the so-called digital world is based upon inequality, based upon relationships of asymmetry. Nonetheless, this is very much an important time because the vast majority of technology users, the vast majority of Facebook and Google users, for example, are not located in the United States. They're not located in Western Europe. They're actually across the continents of the global south. As an example, the continent of Africa, fastest growing population in the world, youngest population in the world, most rapid internet penetration in the world. Yet how often do we actually think about the diversity, the massive amounts of diversity in this continent when we think about the design, monetization, and even value systems, the ontological systems by which we design technology? And this is very important because every major technology company and technologization in and of itself is expressed increasingly through AI technologies, artificial intelligence technologies. We all know that. But we also are increasingly coming to terms, and I see that Joy is on the other stage right now, or I heard that she's on the other stage right now, that algorithmic bias is the new normal. That we build technologies based on who we are, but if who we are represent just a small component of the world, whether it's Silicon Valley, Seattle, or perhaps China and Shanghai and Beijing, we're obviously going to build these technologies based on who we are, which means bias is part of humanity, right? And so that's very, very important because if you build technologies based on how you view the world, much like I wrote the book based on how I view the world, and those technologies are learning technologies, meaning they're learning from data sets that reflect the inequalities of our world, then those technologies are going to produce biased outcomes. And the problem is the absence of audit in such systems and the absence of collaborative design. From everything from predictive policing systems to AI systems involving life insurance and risk, we're very rarely involving the populations most subject to the decisions made by these technologies in the design of the technologies themselves. And that's why President Obama, in a simple face beautifying application, when it was applied on his face, built by a company called FaceApp in St. Petersburg, Russia, his face turned whiter and younger as a result. It's not because the company or its developers are racist or maybe ageist. It's because they are building technologies based on who they are. So that's why we need the global revolution in technology to actually be global. Rather than a few people engineering technologies for society and without even really knowing it, engaging in social engineering. So this is very important on a global level, right? As I mentioned, the mass majority of users and people connected to the internet through mobile telephony and other systems are across the continents of the global south. And if algorithmic and computational technologies are optimized for one thing and one thing only, which is to keep people's attention, then rumors will become the new normal. And that's why we see issues across the board on a global level, from Myanmar to Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, to misinformation influencing the political campaigns in the United States and Jair Bolsonaro, but even here in Brazil, even here in Sri Lanka, where rumors became the new normal and resulted in violence on Facebook because people started to see these things as legitimate sources of news and engaged in violence accordingly. So these geographic gaps of asymmetry around the design of technology can create real-life outcomes, for vulnerable and marginalized people. And that's why there's an opportunity to do something better right now. So with that in mind, a range of different companies are trying to get closer to the populations they're impacting. In Beyond the Valley, I had an opportunity to talk to a number of African AI developers who are thinking about political and economic and even cultural value systems in relation to the technologies they're building. And Google has set up an AI lab in Ghana, in Accra. And they're trying to think about these issues because Google's image recognition systems have also turned out at various times to be racist as well. Again, not intentional, but a product of an unequal and racist world. And we can even see the Chinese influence, the geopolitical and economic influence of Chinese expansionist attempts with technology, right? Which are very material in their impact. So, of course, we think about Xi Jinping and the new Silk Road. I tell some stories about this. I talk to a number of Chinese tech execs off the record primarily. And their attempts are to think about the relationship between labor and supplies and the monetization of all this in very specific territorial ways. So I visited coltan mines on the border of Uganda and Congo that were owned by Chinese companies and observed the geopolitics of this. I observed various Uber strikes in Uganda as well. Really interesting to see the real-life impacts of technologies built from afar. And so the new Silk Road is one of these models of thinking about relationships between supplies and raw minerals even, lithium in Bolivia, for example, These are very real relationships that undergird this digital revolution as we know it, and we have to think very carefully about all the stakeholders at play if we really want an internet that lifts everybody up, rather than an internet that is zero-sum. So that's why I wrote this piece. When the book came out, I wrote several pieces for the mainstream media. I did a lot on MSNBC and National Public Radio in the United States, but I wrote this piece for Wired as well, and I have a piece coming out in The Guardian in the next week called Why We Need a Digital Bill of Rights. And what I look at in this piece for Wired, which I published a couple weeks ago, about a little over a month ago, is really this question of what innovation actually is. So let's think about that. Is innovation having infinite resources and creating the latest and greatest device based on the previous latest and greatest device? Or perhaps can we also think about innovation as resourcefulness, doing more with less? Innovation with scarcity, right? Thinking about an economic system where we try to think about sustainability, renewability, life cycles of technology on multiple different levels. And so I write this based on ethnographic work and stories I gathered and share in this book of people who are really thinking about digital technology in bottom-up ways, around different kinds of values and models, whether they're environmental or collective-based, or rooted even in the traditions that peoples have in our extremely diverse world. And I want to just give you a couple examples of this before we wrap up this morning. First of all, here's the story. Briefly, I want to share the story of my friend Osvaldo. So Osvaldo is a canela farmer and a coffee farmer. He's an indigenous man, a Zapotec man from Oaxaca, which is in southern Mexico, but he's up in the mountains of Oaxaca. It's a magical area. It's super biodiverse and also deeply linguistically diverse. And he is a member of a Zapotec community, and he was a community radio practitioner. And Osvaldo is one of many people, now 35,000+ people apparently, across over 30 different independent communities in the Oaxacan mountains, in the Sierra Norte, Sierra Sur, all around the region, who are building the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world. No cell phone providers would come there. Googles and Facebooks don't think it's worth the investment either to bring their own type of technology in. They're not worth the investment to Carlos Slim and Telcel. But these guys want the connectivity for a range of different reasons, including because their languages are oral. They've very rarely been written, but also for communication rights, for economic issues, for political issues. And instead of just being upset about it, they built it themselves, using open source technology, mesh network technology, voice over IP technology, and tethering all of these things. And this is an example of how ingenuity and resourcefulness can happen with people who collectively engage in the design of a technology and the building of a technology. And this project is called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria, Indigenous Community Telephony. It's also called Rhizomatica, which is kind of a take on Deleuze's concept of the rhizome, which is really powerful to think about that people can do this, indigenous peoples can do this. They are not simply subjects of our decisions, they are innovators in their own right. So let me give you a couple other examples of this. These are quite magical. Just a little bit further south to Oaxaca, I've been visiting this collective of early 20-something kids. They're teachers, they're activists, they're from small communities in the region of Chiapas. And they very much worship cosmologically the idea of a snail, the caracol, because the snail has sort of a sense of circularity and timelessness to it. It's almost mythologized. And they try to apply this idea to building their own technology networks. They built their own community radio stations, they built their own intranet, local networks, and they built a mechanism for their own internet connectivity. But they have almost no money at all, but they're young and they believe in it, they're into the free software world, all of these things. So how did they start to make this happen? Well, they couldn't afford satellite internet. The telecom providers said they weren't worth the investment, so they bought one landline connection 30 miles away, and they linked it to a set of small kind of bamboo towers that relayed the signal across different local mountaintops. And they brought the connection into their community. This is a whole other notion of collective and community sovereignty around technology. This project is called Ictacop, which is in Mayan, in Celtal, is translated as words in the wind. And for these people, there is no concept of private property. Everything is collective. And this might gross some of you out, but even when their children are born, they hang the umbilical cords on the trees because there's no disconnection between the body and the land. It's kind of a magical way of thinking about technology, right? We have that possibility if we think beyond the valley in particular ways. And that's not to critique or criticize or be tough on anybody. It's to open up our consciousness and understanding of whose voices guide this digital transformation moving forward. Even, in Nairobi, a bubbling place of technology innovation. We're going to hear from some great innovators in Nairobi, including Juliana from Ushahidi a little bit later today, or tomorrow, I think. I had a chance to write several chapters of this book about African bottom-up entrepreneurship, collective tech innovation in a range of different manners. And one of the most interesting experiments, an entrepreneur, Eric Hirschman, who started Ushahidi along with Juliana, I had a great chance to write about him and his company, which is called BRIC, B-R-C-K. Solar-powered Wi-Fi routers, mesh network technologies. But they realize, again, in Kenya, there's a major value system of collectivity. Everything is, not everything, but many things are collectively owned. And people there realize that they need to build their connectivity in ways that respond to the collective values of the population. So what do they actually do? They embed their routers in these moving minivans that have pictures of Bob Marley and Nas here, the American hip-hop artist, on the moving minivans. And they actually realize that access to the internet can be best accomplished in a way that really embraces people, not in one person per computer or one person per laptop, but in public kinds of spaces like these moving vans. So what people do when they access the routers and these internet connections in these moving vans is they engage in collective conversations about journalism, cultural life, political life, who they are, connections between families. It's a whole other model of thinking about internet connectivity outside of social media that is actually in many cases antisocial. So this is a very interesting model as well. They're trying to employ these routers, solar-powered, renewable, to test soil, to look at soil quality, to look at water quality. They've even set up some infrastructures, or they're working on that right now, in refugee camps on the border of Somalia and Kenya, where Ilhan Omar, one of our congresswomen in the United States, actually spent some of her childhood. So there's a whole other model that you can see when you think about real innovation from the ground up. You can see this idea that some people describe in Swahili to me as jukali. Jukali is translated as hot sun. Hot sun. And what are these people doing? They're taking technologies and reimagining them according to their constraints. They're being resourceful by doing more with less. They're taking things that are designed to die and giving them new life. Look what's happening here. They're taking devices that have been thrown away. We all know that our iPhones are designed to die. This is a model that we call planned obsolescence. Is it really so different than a Monsanto seed that is designed to die? Well, what are these people doing? They're actually recovering technology. They're repairing technology. And they're actually giving it new forms of life and new forms of innovation and creating more value, more employment, more digital literacy. And this is a whole other model. All it takes is a table, a soldering gun, and the hot sun. And you won't believe this, but I not only observed this in action with Maria here in Kibera in Nairobi, building technologies out of the old, creating new out of the old, creating new business opportunities for her and her community. But I even observed this with 3D printers. So we know the massive problems of e-waste. We know that these are huge issues and huge challenges. We know that these are creating cancer for people in landfills. We don't know where our phones go when we turn them in, but they often end up creating environmental impacts and even health impacts. But people here are taking largely some significant, almost 50% of thrown away, discarded waste electronics, and they're bringing them together with other devices to build 3D printers and incubate a new 3D printer market in Kenya. That is absolutely incredible for me to see. This is Africa-born 3D. And how are they doing this? Through an innovation that understands their local community and their local environmental conditions. Innovation is rooted in place. It's rooted in culture. It's rooted in economic realities. And this is the most incredible thing of all, and I'll end right here, just with one other note after this, is these 3D printers outperform American and Chinese 3D printers, and they're a fraction of the cost. They're more like the Chinese printer costs. Why is it that they outperform those technologies? Because they're built by people who are designing them with an understanding of the realities and constraints of the places where they're building those technologies. They outperform them mechanically in terms of design, in terms of resistance to various sorts of threats, environmental threats, physical threats. And that's amazing that innovation can happen not by having fancy degrees from Stanford and MIT, but by actually hacking. This is really hacking, repairing, tinkering, playing. And this is a whole model that I'm actually, and this might seem like quite a leap, I've been helping with policy with Senator Sanders in the United States. I'm part of his national campaign. And we are trying to think about these very ideas, how we can learn from beyond the valley as we think about the incredible economic inequalities in our country and around the world. 8 people in our world with equivalent wealth to 3.95 billion people. So what does an Internet for All plan look like, which I helped this team draft? It's a plan that thinks about local innovators, thinks about opening up and democratizing opportunity to build and create and engineer and tinker and transform technologies. And I'm telling you, you might see that I'm actually an optimist, despite my critiques. And I really do maintain that optimism because I do believe that we can get to an internet that lifts everybody up if we give everybody an option and a chance. But to do so, we really have to think in terms that are beyond the valley and look at the realities that are happening in the world right here and right now, moving forward. So thank you so much for having me.